So welcome to the closing session of the day. It's my great privilege and delight to be here with Cathy Moore. So I've been a great admirer of Cathy's work for many years. Cathy is the originator of the action mapping process, which I think it's fair to say is now pretty much the standard way of designing really active and performance-focused learning right around the world, really. I see it quoted back to me when I'm meeting with people. So really, I think that the fullness of the room is a good reflection of how great Cathy's work is. So without further ado, I shall hand over to you, Cathy.
Thank you all for coming. We are going to talk about how we can help people learn. A lot of our clients and our colleagues think that the best way to help people learn is this way. Carefully introduce them to the basics. Give them all the support they could possibly need. Inch them towards slightly more challenging situations. But be very careful. You don't want to ask them to do something that's too hard. A lot of the time, we in learning and development are so concerned about this that we say, let's pretend the deep end doesn't exist at all. Let's give them a Jeopardy game. Let's give them a drag and drop to get them acquainted with the concepts. Let's expose them to the ideas. But let's pretend the deep end doesn't exist. But our learners aren't children. They're adults. Adults are more open to risk. I'd actually argue that children are too. I don't think we give them enough credit. But adults are more open to risk than we are acknowledging in our work. Some may be more willing to take risks than others. I would be the one standing in the corner holding onto the railing. But we enjoy risk when we can control how much risk we have, and we enjoy learning something hard and getting good at it. During the keynote this morning, Marshall showed a matrix that two of the quadrants, one quadrant in the sort of unsatisfying section, was stimulation. Stimulation to me is clicky, clicky, bling, bling stuff in an e-learning course. The more satisfying quadrant was called success. In order to feel successful at something, we have to first be challenged. And no matter how much we try to define our audience, there is still going to be a range of prior experience and prior skills. So no matter how well defined it is, we say we're going to talk to beginners in this, there are still, because they are adults with varying life experience, there's going to be different levels of skill. Some will already know the basics. But we take this diverse audience of people with life experience and we treat them all like this. And some people would say, well, what if we have something that we know they have never seen before? It does not exist on Earth yet. And we're going to show it to them, and we know for sure that they have never seen it before, and they are all rank beginners. Isn't this the way we have to do it? And I'd say, what if we could do this? What if we could make the risk-taking that is so fun safe and let people learn by plunging in? We're going to briefly look at a scenario that I wrote just to make a point. It's not a scenario that's supposed to model good scenarios. It's a scenario to give you an experience to make a point. So we're going to go briefly into that. And then you'll notice that on your tables there are handouts. And the handout includes 2 makeovers, which are training projects that your eager colleague has already decided how you should design it. And what we're going to do is take a step back from what the eager colleague has decided and consider maybe other ways to do it that are more in keeping of this approach, the let them jump in approach. So first a scenario, and then you're going to work with the people at your table, and then we'll talk about what you've come up with. You've just got a new job. You are a journalist, a globe-trotting journalist, and you have to, at the drop of a hat, rush to some other place in the world where there's a breaking story to cover it. One of the stories that's been happening recently is a series of UFO sightings over Central Asia. One of the countries that has these sightings is beautiful Uzbekistan. So you may have to drop everything, run from wherever you are to some remote corner of Uzbekistan to cover something related to these UFOs in case something happens. But driving in Uzbekistan is a little challenging. You can always hire a guide, but he may not speak English. So your goal in your busy life is to learn just enough Zeko to be able to navigate from the airport to some site. You want to learn just enough navigational Zeko, so like left, right, forward, so you can get from the plane to the news story before anybody else. The traditional way for somebody to teach you Zeko would be to present a bunch of information and then test you to see if you got that information. And in the case of language learning, the information is vocabulary. And so we might do some flashcards, like a lot of flashcards. And then we have a drag and drop, where you associate the English word with the foreign word that you just learned like 2 screens ago. And then we have a game where it goes the other way, where you see the foreign word, and you have to identify the English word that it refers to. If we're lucky, we might actually have a contextual activity that refers to what we are trying to learn, which is how to navigate. But again, it's a translation activity. The person in the car says left, and you have to click on the word that means left. This is all translating in your head and memorizing terms. The traditional approach, present information and give them an activity. We're going to try something different. And hopefully you can read this. If you can't read it, please wave frantically. Good, nobody's waving. I won't read it to you. I'll give you a chance to read this, and then we will click the link to continue. At the bottom of the screen, we have a choice. I'd like to see a show of hands. Who would like to say, where is Yodgor? We must speak to Yodgor. Any votes for that one? Looks like everybody wants to just get going. We have to beat Agence France-Presse. That's a good choice. That first word is a link, because if we click it, we hear what freitur sounds like. I'm going to spare you that. I just said the word, it sounds like freitur. Now we have a choice. What do we do? Do we turn on the windshield wipers, or do we pull onto the road? Votes for windshield wipers? We got some votes for windshield wipers, votes for just going onto the road. We have slightly more people who don't care about the windshield. We will go straight ahead. All right. You are adults. You have not learned this word. You are struggling. You have a 50% chance of failure. Are you panicking? Are you upset? Is this traumatizing? Votes for turning right? Votes for turning left? Right one. We were wrong. Are we traumatized? What have we learned? We've certainly learned the word for no. It's right there on the screen. Kurtol has shown up a lot of times referring to left. And I'm going to stop it there. The story continues. You've maybe gone through half of it, a third of it. In the rest of the story, you reinforce left and right and straight. You also learn stop. You also learn how to bribe somebody. You learn the word for cigarette, part of the bribe. And that at the very end of the story, you have a little graphic organizer that the fictional you has created at the end, showing that Kurtol means left, heat means right, freitur's forward. We'll take a look at that in a second. But my question to you, I didn't see anybody doing this. A lot of our clients or our stakeholders, when we propose just throwing people into it and giving them a guided, safely controlled experience, they say, but it's not fair. People will be upset if we ask them to do something before they've been 1,000% prepared. And not only do adults not dissolve into tears, oh, and here's a little summary. This is a little summary the fictional you draws at the end. I'm not saying that this is an efficient way to learn a language. I just put this together to give you the experience of, I know nothing about this topic. There is no way I could know anything about this topic. And here I am being asked to use information that I don't know. How horrible is it? It's not that horrible. It's actually somewhat more interesting to a lot of people than studying a bunch of flashcards. It is also possibly more effective. Make It Stick is a great book that summarizes a lot of learning research. Highly recommend it. It's a great source of quotes like this, so when you have clients pushing back against slightly different approaches, you can point them to this book. Trying to solve a problem before being taught the solution leads to better learning, even when errors are made. And one of the arguments I hear often is, but they will only remember the error. They'll only remember the wrong way to do it. They go on in the book to say, no, they will not remember the error as long as they have correction. Ludo very happily corrected us immediately when we made the wrong choice. We had correction. So the traditional approach is this, because we are so afraid of challenging people to do something before they've been 10,000% prepared. What we just did was the extreme opposite. We said, we are not preparing you at all, and we are not giving you any help. There was no dictionary app for you to look things up in. You were on your own driving. You couldn't look at something. We did actually have a little bit of information tacked on the end. Here's a little summary of what you learned in this activity. This is actually what I'd recommend becomes sort of the default for what we do when we are helping adults learn to do something. We give them a series of activities, and each activity optionally links to the information they need to complete the activity. So we say, you are adults. We're teaching you consultative sales. You are all salespeople with anywhere from 1 to 30 years of experience. Some of you have already, in previous jobs, done consultative sales. We're not going to assume that everybody is equally ignorant. We're going to let you pull as much information as you need to complete this activity. These symbols come from action mapping. Since it's in the title of the talk, I thought I'd better have a slide on it. The way it works, let's say that we are teaching managers how to apply the rules for family leave. We have a business goal, which is a goal that we create with our client, the person who signs the check, and with our subject matter experts. And that goal says the organization will benefit in the following way by the project we're about to do. In the case of the course on family leave, say we're concerned about lawsuits. We've got too many lawsuits by people who have been incorrectly denied family leave, so we want to reduce lawsuits. That second ring around the goal, the triangles, represent specific real-world on-the-job behaviors that people have to perform to reach that goal. So the one that we're pointing at there, let's say that that is the action of correctly offer medical or family leave to somebody with a foster child. So there's rules that apply to foster children. The hand represents the fact that, I'm skipping steps, but let's say that we've decided that training is part of the solution. The hand represents a practice activity that lets people practice their on-the-job behavior. So in this case, a practice activity could be fictional person Jorge wants to welcome home the 12-year-old homeless boy that he has just been assigned to foster, but he's supposed to be meeting with an important client. What do you do? So we brainstorm, that's going to be our activity. And then finally, we look at the information that they need only to complete that activity. Just the information they need to make a correct decision about foster care, family medical leave. The traditional approach. If we had an eager colleague here, she would say, let's do a presentation on the rules for family leave that relate to foster children. Lots and lots of slides of presentation, and then we have this scenario-typed activity where we have to make a decision about Jorge. Take a step back from that and think about this information that we're presenting on all those slides. What actually must be memorized? What could the manager look up? And what is actually not necessary, such as the date that the law was passed? The stuff that they have to memorize, we need to get into their brains somehow. The stuff they can look up goes into a job aid of some sort. The stuff that's nice to know, we keep the subject matter expert happy by putting one of those learn more links that nobody ever clicks. And when we look at the example we're talking about now, deciding whether Jorge should get family leave for this foster kid arriving, there is very little that the manager has to memorize. They have to memorize the fact that there are rules about this, and here is where the rules live. Here is where I can look up the rules. They don't have to memorize the fine details of the rules because they're not making this decision under duress. They get an email from Jorge, he says, my kid's coming, can I get leave, or how do we arrange this? And you say, let me get back to you in 5 minutes, and you look it up, and you make your decision. It's not an emergency thing. You're not having to drive in Zekostan while you're making decisions. So actually, in this example, there is nothing really that they need to memorize. We're helping them use the job aid. So we can move from present all the information and then give them an activity to give them an activity, just plunge them right into it, and they can look at the job aid for help in making the decision. So look how many slides we just lost. We also saved the learner the experience of being presented to for several slides and then having an activity. This activity with a job aid might look like this. And there's a button that says guidelines. Having trouble making a decision about this? Click the button, you'll see the real-world job aid if you've been able to make it useful. Or if you've worked with the legal department, a plain English version of the rules. So the advantage of this is if I already kind of know the rules, I can make my decision and see the consequence of it. And it might be a bad consequence, at which point I realize, whoa, I didn't know as much as I thought. I'm going to have to click at these guidelines and catch up. I don't have the choices and the consequences here just to keep things clean. Are there any reactions to this? Anybody have ideas, concerns, reactions so far? They're very quiet. Is there a mic?
Just a comment. We are building in our company the training in that way. And we have exactly the two opposite opinions about it from the users. So like 50% of them love it and 50% of them hate it.
Have the haters explained why they hate it?
That we test something that we haven't taught.
But do they not see the button they can click?
Still, that's the opinion.
Okay.
Probably because, well, the company, I work in the petrol industry, and we have got workers like aged 18 to 67.
Oh, okay.
So this can be associated with age, of course, but that's the reality.
Well, thanks for sharing that, because that's an extremely good point. You need to know your audience, obviously, if you can. And one thing in the full model for action mapping, I really strongly suggest is that we do prototypes and test the prototypes on actual learners. If we were to prototype this, test it on some real life learners, and if we get 50% saying, it's not fair, you're asking me to make a decision when I haven't been taught anything, and they don't even want to click the button to learn it, then that tells us something important. So, but I think what's happening a lot in L&D is we assume that people are going to have trouble with this. And what I also hear is this argument that it's not fair. It's not fair. And my answer to that is, okay, the alternative is to make everybody sit through the same information presentation. If I already know from another job under the same government the rules of family leave for foster care, why are you forcing me to sit through a presentation about it? That isn't fair. If I'm a raw beginner and you force me to sit through a presentation and the presentation is going at a pace that is not useful to me, that isn't fair. Whereas if you give me this, I have all the time in the world to click this button. I can think about it first, which pulls on pre-existing knowledge and makes us learn a little more deeply. Then I can click the button, and at my leisure, however slowly or quickly I need to, I can read the policy, and then I can make my decision. Yes?
How does it work in real terms in classrooms? So I love the idea. Something we're talking a lot about is how can we personalise learning, how can we make it more relevant, how can we speed up the learning. But if I've got a classroom of 15 people, and some are really experienced and some are really not, have you seen that work in real terms?
So the question is, how do you make this work in, for example, a live session where you've got a mixture of levels? Ideally, you're able to convince the client that you need a different material for different levels, but you're still going to have a range of levels. And if this were in a live one, in fact, this is from a live one, that's why I don't have the multiple choice options, because this is an example from a webinar. You pose this question in your webinar, people have access to the PDF, the guidelines. They can look at it or not. And people start typing, well, technically, I think he's supposed to have leave, but this thing with you should make him wait until after the meeting with the client. And so somebody says that, somebody else disagrees, there's discussion going on. The beginners who maybe aren't saying very much are learning from the discussion. So it's, I think, yeah?
Kind of set up in live sessions, and I break people, I maximize the limit of 40 people in a session, because beyond that it kind of becomes too noisy to manage. But I had them in groups of about 5 or 6, and then we give them case studies. And they typically are real case studies with kind of grey area questions that then people who are experienced can bring their experience to the table, and people who are young can offer their opinions as well. That's a great way to learn, actually, with mixed levels of learners.
The more discussion you can have, the easier it is to manage the different levels. And also makes it more interesting for the participants. Yes?
Yes, I'm wondering how you convince the trainers that this is the best way of doing it instead of sticking to their old PowerPoint presentations, for instance.
That's a really good question. If this is e-learning and we're in charge, that's not a problem. If we're designing training to be delivered by somebody else, and like we're writing the guide for how to present this stuff, yeah, that would be a political situation to handle with the trainers. One thing, though, is that it is actually, to me, as a trainer-type person, it is more fun to do it this way because there's a lot more discussion. However, it would also be scary. If the training person isn't a subject matter expert, the discussion could easily veer into gray areas that they don't know how to answer. So they're losing control. They're no longer the sage on the stage. The conversation is going somewhere, so I could see how that would be an issue.
It actually was an issue for me because what I'm training on is legal compliance. So my trainers are lawyers. They love PowerPoints. They love lots of words. So I've taken them all away from them. I've given them case studies and workshops and slides with very few words on them, mostly pictures and bullet points. But in their speaker notes of their slides, I give them all of the script. I tell them exactly what I would say if I was delivering this. And in the workshop case studies, I give them a trainer version that has all the answers that the subject matter experts have helped me develop. And then I take them, before they deliver a session, I give them a session, I train the trainer session. So I take them through the materials, I give them examples of how I would deliver it, and leave it open to questions. So it means a lot of work from me, but it's very much worth it, and it's really been well received. They love it, and the people who are coming to the sessions love it. They used to come dragging their knuckles, well, they still kind of do drag their knuckles, but at least now they enjoy it, you know. A little bit more than they would have.
We can talk later, I think.
Yeah. It does sound like it's more work for us to develop this thing, yes.
Sorry, what I'd just add to that is get your trainers involved earlier. Get them part of this process.
Yeah.
Don't get them, just have it delivered to them and tell them to change.
And that is part of the whole spiel about action mapping, is we include the stakeholders as early in the process as possible, because then they buy in and they commit to reaching this goal. And then once they've committed, they have to behave.
I think it's also a question of soft skills, because some people reject the idea of managing the change. And thank you. And when people are used to a style of learning, they automatically reject the idea of changing it, especially when they feel comfortable on something. And I joined the idea of the lady who spoke first. This is one of the reasons why people reject e-learning and new technologies, I think.
So it's a cultural change, really, for a lot of us, because of what I was showing is the traditional way to teach people. And I'm not saying that that's bad at all. That original slide of her holding that little kid with his tongue sticking out, that's scaffolding. Scaffolding is great. You're making sure you don't overwhelm the learner. But I think that we in L&D have gone too far in the sort of babying the learner thing, especially when we can do something so efficient as this. You go pull as much information as you need. It's going to be different for every person. That, I think, shows more respect for the learner than, let me hold your hand through this scary thing.
Just to add to that, I've used action mapping on dozens of projects over the years, and somebody mentioned the subject matter experts. They are really nervous. If they've done their preparation, they come to you with this big stack of stuff that they want to cover, and you go, fantastic. Thanks so much for that. I'm just going to put it over here on the floor, and we're going to get a blank sheet of paper. But once what I've found is when you talk them through the logic of action mapping and how it works and how it all contributes towards changing the behaviour and achieving that organisational goal, you can't argue with that logic. I mean, it just makes perfect sense. And once they've got their heads around that, which takes 10 minutes, they're totally on board with it.
The whole model I developed at first to get the subject matter experts to behave, to try to keep them from saying, you got to tell them this, and you got to tell them that, and you got to tell them that. And I thought, oh. So I think this is where we do the thing. We do the thing here. You have a handout at your table, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start counting. There are two possible projects, number 1 and number 2. And what you're going to do, your table is going to be assigned 1. Let me look at a handout, remember what I did. Your table will be assigned 1, and you'll see the project. Well, you also see, on page 2, there is a handy flowchart that you may find useful, which helps you decide whether something needs to be memorized and therefore put maybe in a practice activity or some sort of drill, or whether it could be looked up. And then you'll read the little brief summary of your project. You will read, you have an eager colleague. I'm sure we've all had this colleague. Ooh, we should do this. And you have to be the one that says, let's talk about that. That's what we're going to be doing. You have an eager colleague that says, let's do it the traditional way. And you're going to say, at the bottom of the page, you're going to say, let's ask these 5 questions. So, and then we'll spend like 20 minutes. I'm going to give you guys 20 minutes to hash through this. It could take hours if we really got into it. But 20 minutes, and then we'll get back together as a group to talk about what you discovered and what you decided to do with this project. But I'm going to assign you randomly 1 or 2, and I'm going to start over here. You guys are 1. 2, 1, 2, you guys are 1, you've got 2, you've got 1, you've got 2, you guys are 1 and 2, 1 in the corner, 2 over here, you've got 1, 2 over here, and we got an extra 1. So take time to read it. Discuss. I will wander around and answer any questions or pester you at random. And then we'll get together as a big group again. Some sort of decisions. Let's talk about those decisions. So we had, those of you at tables 1, you had a software training challenge, where people are using a CRM, they're tech support people, So if you're one of these people, your job is to answer the phone, and while talking on the phone, call up information about this caller. If that information doesn't exist, you have to create a new record. While you're talking to the person, you're recording what their problem is, you're searching for the solution, and you're tagging that solution. After the call, you might do some more stuff with the record. So, the first question, what job tasks do people need to practice so they can do them without help? What was your decision on that? What needs practicing?
Mainly the note-taking.
I'm sorry?
Mainly the element of note-taking.
The note-taking?
Yes, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about that.
There's various aspects of it, but we felt the most important thing that they seemed to have most difficulty with was taking notes as to what the problem was that are good enough that when someone else takes the follow-up call, they can understand them. So
And
that's the core.
Which would they need to practice, the taking notes during a call or taking notes after a call?
It's a bit of both. Yes, a bit of both.
Oops. Does everybody agree that they need to practice both the call and the after the call stuff? Or can we focus just on what they need to do during the call? Because that's the hard thing. Because I would suggest as a extremely frugal developer that we could throw our money at the thing that they have to do that's hardest, which is, here I am on a call, all this information's coming in, the person is upset, I'm talking to the person, and I'm using the software. Overload. So I need to practice it in a safe place. The safe place that my loving training designer has created online for me. So my suggestion would be the stuff that they do after the call. How do I do this? There's a help screen in the software. Encourage them to click and look it up. We certainly need some sort of campaign to make sure they do it. But I would argue maybe a practice activity will not make them do it. They're not doing it because they don't know the follow-on effects. This is more like a campaign. It's more of a communication thing. Maybe a practice activity will not convince them to do it. The practice activity is to help them practice in a safe place something that is hard. Does this make sense? Number 2, what information do they absolutely require to complete the task that they have to practice? So further up on the page, what was the answer? What do they actually need to memorize? What information do they require? We haven't divided it up yet. So I'm on a call. What do I need to know? I'm sorry? How to open the record for the caller, how to create a new record if the caller isn't in the database. How to choose the product, we've got a list here. Basically, yeah, points 1 through 4 at the top there. Because notice we're focusing on what they're doing during the call. This is the information that they have to know in some form to complete the challenging thing, which is use the software during a phone call with an upset person. There's other things that they need to know how to do after the call, like flesh out the notes, flag the record, assign mystery codes to the record. These are things that can be done at their relative leisure. The call is over, there's nobody upset talking at them. If they don't remember the code to use, they can look it up. So that's leading into that third question. Of the information that we've said that they need to know, what must they memorize and what could they look up? So what's your answer to that? What do they need to memorize? I'm sorry? How to fill in the form during the call. I'm sorry? 1, 2, and 4. Yeah, 3 is write free form notes describing the problem. It's not clear if they have to do that during the call or if that's something they can do after the call. So I think that if we're going to be super efficient, we can certainly model that. And also, how much do they need to be trained on that too? Yes?
I'm just thinking, just for the lockdowns, what have you, even that, do you really need to actually memorize everything? Could you have like a little thing on your little card next to your desk just telling you what all the problem codes are?
Right. The question is, do they even have to memorize, choose the product and type of problem from the drop-down menus? There's really very little knowledge involved in that. The knowledge is, I have to click on this thing and choose the right thing. Ideally, we've designed the software so that it makes sense. We don't have these mystery things in the drop-down menu where people are going, what is this? Does this apply? I have no idea what this is. So there's a user interface component of this as well. We're not training people instead of improving bad software. We're improving the software to the point that it's good, and then we're training people on the bare minimum that they need to use this thing. So we've asked what must they memorize and what could they look up? So we've got just a very small amount of information that they have to memorize, right? Those 3 or 4 of those top points, because it's something that they have to do on the fly in a difficult situation. Does everybody agree to that, or is there any disagreement? We have question 4. Is everyone equally ignorant, or might some people already know more than others? This is a question that we often fail to ask in L&D. We assume ignorance. In the setup for this, we said that the system has been in place for 5 months. The original training was a 1-day workshop. Obviously, that failed because we have people screwing up. But that doesn't mean that they know nothing. Some people are doing it halfway decently. Some people are screwing up terribly. So the answer to 4 is clearly, not everyone is equally ignorant. Question 5, how could we design a practice activity so everyone quickly learns just what they need to know to do the difficult task? So what are your ideas for that? Tables 1, yes.
Well, we assume that not everyone was ignorant, so by asking subtly if they feel that they're more confident in this new program, we would find some super users or some supervisors that could help the others, maybe listening in on phone calls, sitting next to them, doing training sessions, maybe a mystery caller, the mystery caller being another colleague.
So if I say that I feel pretty confident in the system, I don't even have to do the e-learning. I can have, is that what you're saying?
No, you would probably have to do it just to show us.
Okay.
But being from Norway, no Norwegian would ever say, I feel super confident in this. so we would have to be a bit subtle to maybe find those geniuses. And maybe also ask the tech people, the people who wrote the system, to dumb it down so that we could translate it. Some kind of, something that they can comprehend, the people working. And we thought we could have actual cases and have like a Q&A, so people sitting together and handling an actual case and deciding together what would be the correct answer.
So you could have like small groups, and then somebody either acts the caller, or I come in and say, okay, I'm an upset caller, and the widget isn't doing this. And then you as a group decide which drop-down do you choose, how do you describe it?
Yes, because probably somebody, collectively, we would be able to manage this one call.
So this is a solution that harks back to what we were talking about earlier. If you have a varied level of expertise, a discussion is often useful, because the newbies are learning from the more experienced people and vice versa, actually. So if this were self-paced e-learning, is there any ideas for a totally me alone at the computer learning this thing? Any ideas for that? We got one here. Whoops, we got one there.
Sorry. So our idea was that it would be a returning customer. So in this module, they would find the notes that were incomplete and therefore have to suffer the consequences. So then they immediately saw the behavioural reasons why they should be changing. And then they'd go through this. They'd either do well or badly. And then they'd get following modules based on how they've done. So if they completely messed it up, they'd be suggested to take more. If they did really well, they say, fine, you're great, go back to work. And then there's kind of some balance in between where you choose the modules that you want to do.
So this is sort of, if I take mediocre notes during my fictional phone call, I will then see my fictional colleague in the future going, when the person calls back, going, what? Or saying something wrong because of my bad notes.
Yeah, or if the drop down is wrong, or whatever you you find difficult personally within that, because it could be a range of things. So whichever one you're struggling with, then you get a bit more training on if you need it.
So this is sort of viewing the practice activity as in a way to show them the consequences of doing it wrong, in addition to maybe helping them practice doing it right by giving them a fictional call. Any other ideas? We should have a whole wide range of ideas here. We've got a lot of people.
So I think if you weren't able to see from the system where people were having problems and target it through that, let's assume that the system's not good enough to give you that level of detail, then the other one would be to set up a dummy call and everybody has to go through it, because I was sharing with the group that one of the challenges we have is when we ask people to self-assess their competence at all levels in the organisation on any kind of learning, the natural bias is to overestimate how good they are at things, to the point where we've had people telling us that I don't need to go on that training, and then we've done the pre-assessment, it's like, yeah, well, you're getting 50% at the moment. So the suggestion is maybe you would benefit from it.
So that's a very good point where, and I agree, we cannot ask people, how well do you know this, or how confident do you feel, and actually believe them. They need to do at least one activity and prove to me that they do know what they're doing. But if I do that first activity and I ace it, do I have to do the other ones?
No.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. It depends how you did it. If you did one activity, I guess, that covered all the areas, right, not just the first bit of it, and you aced it, then that's it, job done. And in which case you can go train other people. You can be the super user.
And when I'm doing that activity, what sort of help do I have? And how does the information relate to that activity? We've been talking about activities. The information on how to do it, where does that appear? Was it a presentation before the activity? Is it a help link in the activity? Did you guys, I didn't explicitly ask that question, I should have. Did you guys have any ideas on that? Or are we assuming that there's a sort of like, here's how it works, now do this activity? I'm sorry?
Don't give them the information before they go through the activity, just put them into the activity, and if they need to access that information, it's there for them to do that at the time.
And that, to me, that's the most efficient solution, and it also means that I, as the learner, am in charge of pulling what I need. And I know what I need because I'm looking at this activity going, what? What do I do here? I'm discovering my own lack of knowledge instead of overestimating it, and I'm looking up what I need. Yeah.
For me, the whole goal of this was to increase customer satisfaction, right?
Right, by improving how we use the CRM.
Right, but customer satisfaction, presumably that's coming from a customer satisfaction score, so my assumption was the problems aren't getting solved. So although they were trained 5 months ago and they know how to use the system, the part they're having the difficulty with and what they need is the actual problem solving and associating that with the problem types.
I should have said more explicitly at the beginning that we have analyzed this whole shebang, and we see where it's broken. And part of the broken part is the people answering the phones, saying that the system's too complicated, too hard, so I'm not going to work with it.
Gotcha.
Sorry. I want to make sure we cover the other one as well. The soft skills one, the managerial one. We had managers who had to very specific need. Again, we've done all the analysis. We've determined this really is a training need that will help us reach our higher goal. And we have managers who work in a manufacturer. They have been working in manufacturing for at least 10 years. They're supposed to use the 5 whys of Kaizen. They're supposed to run these meetings. Our consultant says, look out for these problems. Our eager colleague wanted to do this sort of present and activity thing. What is our alternative? So what was the job task that people most need to practice in this situation?
They need to ask questions, not stop asking questions, and not care who they're asking questions of.
So don't treat the 5 whys as we quickly ask these 5 questions until we get to the answer I like, but to make sure that everybody is asking them and they go deep enough. Is that a simple thing?
No, facilitation skills. You have to teach them facilitation skills.
Yeah, it's a facilitation thing. It's a logical, analytical thinking thing. It's knowing when to stop and where the real answer is, which to me all says scenario, because scenarios are great for the gray areas. And when we do this scenario, are we preceding it with 15 slides about the 5 whys and who created them and the industries they're used in and why you should care? Everybody's shaking their head. Maybe we plunge them into this kind of activity and there is a tip sheet on the 5 whys and how they work, maybe with a good example and a bad example. Do this, don't do that. Now go through this branching activity where if you cut the whys off too short, the problem doesn't get solved. Or if you don't manage the people's discussion well, they stop contributing, or whatever. Any number of things could happen.
We actually said that the managers themselves would be brought through a facilitated workshop to do the 5 whys using real problems from the factory, and then that workshop would lend itself to the content for the course. So it would be relevant examples.
So we're suggesting a blended sort of thing, a live workshop to do the tricky parts. Yeah.
Well, it's training the managers how to facilitate the workshop. So they have to go through one themselves first, so they understand where they found it easy, what kind of problems they had, so then they would anticipate the kind of problems that their staff might have.
Yeah.
And the other thing what we said was that the template, the training would really be like a template of 6 pages. The first page would be your scenario, and then you'd have the 5 whys. So it would be options with the first why for them to take an option, take this, or this, and then what happened then, through a real worked example, and showing them the consequences of maybe stopping after 2, because they'd have an option at any point in time to say, is this the final solution?
Mm-hmm.
And showing them the consequences of stopping too soon in the 5 whys, because that's probably the single biggest problem is if you don't go deep enough.
So I want to make sure we got the gestalt here. I was asking you to consider questions that when I've been on e-learning design teams in particular, we have not asked, which is what do they actually need to memorize and what could they look up? That's by far the most powerful question, even if we are in the position of, here are 87 slides, turn them into a course, and we have no right to say no. We can at least say, of these 87 slides, what is the information they really need to memorize and what could be put in a job aid? That alone saves so much suffering on the part of our learners. And does anybody have any big questions remaining? I hope the activity sort of triggered some discussion at your tables about how to do this.
Just a quick one. What we've just used there for our activity, would you recommend that as a kind of starting point to start any project using that concept?
You mean the questions at the end, or the?
Yeah, just the whole thing, the whole structure about looking at your budget, your audience, your goal, behaviours. Is that a good step-by-step process?
Yeah, this is sort of a text version of action mapping. I would actually start with the goal, and then the audience, and then the behaviours. But yeah, definitely you're listing the behaviours before you start talking about information. And when you talk about the information, you're tracking it back to the behavior to say, when they do this thing, can they look something up? We have that flowchart. Or do they have to memorize it? Is that it?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for all of your contributions. Thank you, Cathy, for an awesome session, as always. Hang on, hold your applause. You have a big round of applause in just a minute. So just to let you know, last session of the day, big news is there's free drinks outside. Following the free drinks outside, there's free drinks in the pub. So it's one of my favourite parts of learning technologies. So thanks again, Cathy. Awesome as ever. So Cathy Moore.
Thank you, everyone.